My name is Robin Larson, and I am the Quality Assurance Section Supervisor for the Virginia Department of Forensic Science. We are a full-service forensic science agency providing support to police agencies across the Commonwealth of Virginia via our 4 regional testing laboratories and 1 centrally located calibration laboratory. I have been one of our Qualitrx administrators since we first began implementing our system approximately 5 years ago. Today, I'm going to share some tips and tricks with you that I have learned during that time. The inspiration for this presentation came out of numerous conversations and email exchanges I've had over the years with Patrick Hatcher. Patrick was always willing to be a sounding board, and I often had questions for him about whether or not my ideas were workable or how I might go about accomplishing something within the system. He was often willing to provide suggestions to me on how I might, in his words, punk the system. In this presentation, I'm going to show you how we are creatively incorporating some things like route exceptions, header and footer links, email actions, and document links into our workflow design. I'm mostly going to be talking about our employee telework request workflow, but I'll touch on a couple of other workflows at the end. The employee telework request workflow is depicted here. It is one of the first workflows that I built, and this is the original diagram. To give you a little background, let me step back for a minute. So this is the original diagram, which has since gone through several iterations as new needs arose and as I learned more things. I've often said that if I knew then what I knew now, I would do a lot of things differently in setting up our Qualitrx system, but that's a topic for another day. So to give you a little background on our employee telework request workflow, our policy states that an employee wishing to telework has to get supervisor and lab director approval as well as HR acknowledgement. The agreements must be renewed annually on or before the anniversary of the original approval. And they also have to agree to abide by certain department and state policies related to teleworking. When we initially set this workflow up, we were still using a paper form that the employee would fill out, and they would sign it, and their supervisor would sign it, and then they would upload the form to Qualitrx to complete the remainder of the process, which also included the policy agreements. So expiration was set at 355 days, and then at that point a reminder was sent to the workflow to resubmit their telework request. Part of the issue that arose from this was that delays at the HR acknowledgement step meant that workflows were not actually expiring until after the anniversary of the original approval. All workflows expired, even ones that had been denied, and data could be overwritten. Now this meant that maybe previous forms weren't necessarily being retained, and also that employees weren't necessarily agreeing to abide by the policies every year because those fields were already filled in, so they weren't having to go and click agree again. So the top box is my first attempt at resolving the expiration issues. The idea I had was to put a step to launch a reminder after the director approval. When the reminder workflow was launched, there was a system email sent to the employee telling them how to go in and set the reminder, and they basically just would have to go in and advance the workflow. There was a time delay on the route to launch a new employee telework request. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work the way I had envisioned because a glitch in the system caused the new employee telework request to launch immediately. And as you can imagine, that caused a little bit of confusion for some folks. So I quickly worked with Qualitrx support to come up with a solution, and we moved the launch reminder step to an expiration step. So we made the launch reminder step an expiration step, and I will get to in a little bit how we accomplished that. So this is the current version of the employee telework request workflow. As you can see, it's gotten significantly more complex. I don't know about you, but I found that sometimes the workflows I think are going to be simple end up being complicated. So typically, only our administrative staff have been approved to telework in the past, and we have certain positions that are pre-approved for teleworking. As you can imagine, our scientific staff that work in the lab can't really do their job from home, at least not much of it. So, but along came a pandemic, and we made some exceptions to allow some file reviews to occur away from the laboratory and other tasks that employees could do from home 1 day a week. We also allowed some flexible scheduling to try and limit the number of people that were in, especially our more populated laboratories at one time, to try and keep that social distancing. So the workflow needed some modifications to allow employees to request exceptions to telework. So we built some route exceptions in that if an exception was needed, the workflow would route immediately to HR and then to the agency director for their approval prior to really getting into the main part of the workflow. So once approval has been granted from HR and from the agency director, it goes back to employee submits telework request. And then at that point it's submitted to their supervisor, because we had also incorporated the supervisor approval into the workflow and discontinued use of the paper form. Some other things we added at this point were rescinding, the option to rescind a previous request if they were no longer approved to telework or no longer wish to, and also some routes back to the employee to edit the workflow when necessary. So I've highlighted this exception or expiration to the launch reminder step, and on the next slide I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we accomplish this. Now, one thing you'll note is that there's a route going in the diagram. There's a route going from close to the launch reminder step, and if you use Workflow Designer a lot, you may know that it doesn't allow you to set or to put a route on a step that has been designated as the end step. But you may not know that it will let you put a route there first and then designate the route or designate the step as the end step. I use my workflow diagrams just to sketch out the process and use them as a visual reference for our end users. I don't ever create workflows from there. I imagine that would give you an error if you tried to create a workflow with a route coming from the end step. But it works for me. I like to be able to show the end user what happens in the workflow as far as route exceptions and expirations, so I like having them in my diagram. So another thing that Qualtrics doesn't allow you to do is have a step in a workflow that you can't get to that doesn't have a route going to it. So when we first set up the launch reminder step after the close step and had it expire to that step, we put a dummy route within the workflow that was called something like do not select. But I didn't really like that, because I was afraid someone was either going to accidentally select it or that they may press the button just because they were curious and they wanted to see what would happen if they selected the button that said do not select. People who work in forensics do tend to be a curious lot. So I wondered, was it possible to set up a route exception that would never be selected, or maybe could never be selected? So I set up, in this particular workflow, the route exception is set up on the route to close from the HR acknowledgement step. And the list field that triggers it is never actually editable anywhere before that step, or in that step even. So there's no way to ever select the list option that would send it to the launch reminder step from the workflow. The only way to get there is from expiration. An alternative idea to that is you could have a list field option that's not enabled, and it would work that way as well. And I'll have an example of that in a few slides. This one is nothing super earth-shattering. Qualtrics has provided us with the HTML code to do these sorts of things at previous conferences and on their on the support page. But since we had so many people who were not familiar with the process of our employee telework request workflow, I thought it would be useful to have some easy references within the workflow. So I added some links to workflow instructions and also to the telework request diagram in the header and footer, so that if they were going through the workflow and they had a question, they could easily access the instructions or the diagram. So I've provided the examples here of what that looks like and the HTML code to achieve that. You would just want to make your instructions and your diagram documents within your document tree, and then copy and paste the show document link and use it like it's demonstrated here. You'll note that the header also includes heading and image tags, and like the instructions and the diagram, the image is also a document within our document tree, and I have added some formatting to that image to make it smaller, because the image itself was rather large. So I've started adding links in my headers and footers in my workflows to our other workflows as well, because I thought this was pretty useful. So the employee telework request reminder workflow is launched on expiration of the employee telework request. One of the things we've noted with using a date field for expiration is that it's not uncommon for the wrong date to be selected. Typically what happens is that people select this year instead of next year, and the workflow expires immediately. So one of the things I incorporated into the reminder workflow is to allow a new date to be selected and the reminder to be relaunched later. So from the employee telework request reminder workflow, employees have three options. They can set a new reminder to be reminded in 11 months or whenever would be appropriate. They can rescind their agreement if they no longer wish to telework or no longer approve to telework, or they can immediately launch a new employee telework request. So in the reminder workflow, the dummy route exception is set up such that the list option is never enabled, so therefore it can never be selected in the workflow. And this I think is probably the ideal way to set them up, but the other one kind of happened by accident and it worked, so I left it alone. So another need that we had, the next few slides I'm going to talk about a couple other workflows and some creative things we're doing to address some specific needs that we had. So in our corrective action workflow, we needed a reminder sent to within a specific time frame to remind the appropriate parties of a task that needed to be completed outside of the workflow. Now, an email reminder only sends to the responsible party of the step the workflow is on. So that really wasn't going to work for this purpose. And I wondered, if I set up an email action with a time delay, will that still be sent if the workflow is no longer on the step that route was going to, where the email action was set up? And it turns out that it will. So to go back a little bit, what we needed was to notify our accrediting body of a significant nonconformity within 30 days of when the corrective action was opened. So I set the email action up with a time delay of 20 days, and I put this on the route when the car number is assigned, which is essentially when our email action, or when our corrective action workflow is really started. Prior to that, it's more of an evaluation of whether or not nonconformity had occurred, and once that's been determined, a team is assigned and a tracking number is assigned. So we set it up for 20 days, past that to give the lab director and the technical services director a few days to get that email generated and sent if they haven't already done it, and if it even applies. Another email action workaround that we've been using is to send an email action report. Now, in our monthly training report workflow, this can be initiated by either the trainee or the training coordinator. Now, only the initiator can see the completed report, and this, sometimes the training coordinator will have initiated it, and the trainee wants to look at the finalized report and see what was in that, or vice versa. So we didn't want to open the instance access to everyone and have everyone be able to see it, but we wanted a way for the people who needed to see what was in the workflow to be able to get that information. So our solution was to come up with an email action that would send a report to all the required parties. This would work well for any HR-related workflow, or really any workflow that you need to maintain confidentiality. At first, the email was set up just very simply, simple format, pulling in the information from the fields in the workflow. And then eventually I added some HTML table formatting to make it look a little more report-like. And here I've provided a portion of the table HTML code that I used and a snip of the email body that corresponds to the code that's here, just so you can get an idea of what that looks like. So also in our corrective action workflow, we are using this top code to create a document within the workflow. So at the close of the workflow, the Director of Technical Services will create a document and upload the finalized CAR report to a folder in Qualtrics, so that we're being very transparent with our staff and they can see what the corrective action disposition was. So to do this, you would navigate to the folder to create this text field. You would navigate to the folder where you want to be creating these documents. Click on the Create Document link or the Create Document button and copy the link to Create Document. And then you'll use the HTML code that's here to create that document link in a text field. You could also use this if you wanted to be able to open a document in a workflow to multiple editors. You would set up a dedicated folder in your document tree, and document editors would be able to change the workflow or change the editor to themselves and edit. And you would want to have specific view and edit permissions set up for that folder in your document tree. Excuse me. So I tried to initially do this with a document link, with a document field, but I found that only published versions can be accessed that way. So if you wanted to have a document and edit accessible in your workflow, you would use Navigate. You would have the user, after they've created the document, copy the web address of the document and edit, and the code would look similar to what is shown here, and you would have them paste that into the text field in the workflow, and then that link would be available to, and you want to format the text field as a web link, and then that document would be available on subsequent steps of the workflow where the document or where the field is viewable. We had entertained using this for our grant application tracking workflow to allow the parties that needed to be able to provide feedback on the grant application documents or contribute to the text itself to be able to just go in and edit the document and access it. For a number of reasons, we decided instead to use a document in our Google Drive, which works really very similarly. You can copy a link to the Google document and share that in your text field. And again, you would want to set it as a web link. So that has been pretty useful for us for the grant application tracking workflow to have that link right within the workflow. It gets sent in an email to the next responsible party in the step to go and look at the grant documents and provide their feedback. So in summary, don't be afraid to be creative in your workflow design. You can use dummy route exceptions and disable the list that triggers the exception, or just not make it editable. You can use links in your header and footer to provide easy reference to instructions or workflow diagrams. Use delayed email actions to send reminders or email actions to send reports. And keep your access to the workflow instances limited. You can also use links within your workflow to create and edit documents. I hope that this presentation has given you some ideas of how you may utilize these concepts in your own workflow design, whether you use them in the same way I have, or it's given you an idea to accomplish some other task that you've been thinking about. I encourage you to be innovative and think outside the box. I want to show my appreciation for my management and colleagues here want to express my appreciation for my management and colleagues here at DFS for their support and for their patience. I also want to express my appreciation to the numerous folks at Qualtrics who have contributed to my knowledge base over the last 5 years. I would call some of you out specifically, but I'm too afraid I'd forget someone. I have learned so much in the 4+ years since we first put that employee telework request workflow online, and I continue to learn every day. I would also like to thank the people, those of you that I've met at previous Qualtrics user conferences and shared ideas with, and I would like to thank all of you who took the time to watch this presentation. Lastly, I would like to dedicate this talk to the memory of Patrick Hatcher. I don't think it's a stretch to say that he is missed by any of us who had the pleasure of and honor of knowing him. Thank you.